There is a scene in the book of Revelation, in Revelation chapter 5, verses 9 and 10, where the heavenly hosts, all of these great spiritual beings, are around the throne of God, and they are singing praise to Jesus, the Lamb. Specifically because in the course of that vision or that story, there's this scroll or this book that is sealed up, and it's revealed that only this Lamb can come and open the seals. And so they start singing his praises. And this is the words of the song that they sing, this new song of praise that they sing to Jesus. In Revelation chapter 5, verses 9 and 10, they sing, "Worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals. For you were slain and purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth." Now, what they praise Jesus for there at the end of the Bible is that Jesus' blood bought people from every tongue and nation. Every nation on earth has an opportunity, because of what Jesus did, to become part of his kingdom, to become part of what he is making. And specifically in verse 10, they praise him because he allowed these people from all of the nations to be made priests of God. But if you're just a casual reader of the Old Testament, that's really odd, isn't it? Because people from every nation don't get to be priests in the Old Testament. In the bulk of the Old Testament, the priesthood of Yahweh belongs to one nation. One nation gets to be priests in the Old Testament, and that's the Israelites. And so we read stories in the Old Testament about Aaron and his sons because they're Israelites and they get to be priests, and it's not for these other nations to serve God in his temple or to serve God in his tabernacle. And we read stories in the Old Testament about various Levitical priests who interact with various kings, and sometimes they're good stories and sometimes they're bad stories, but they're always Israelite stories because Israelites get to be priests, not other nations. We read about the sacrifices in Israel's tabernacle. We read about the things going on in Israel's temple. In fact, if you're reading the Old Testament just casually, it seems like Israel has an exclusive claim on Yahweh's priesthood. But, as one Bible student observed in a book I read about the priesthood, as the story unfolds, we discover that Israel does not have a monopoly on priests. Now, you should already be familiar with this concept. You should already be aware that Israel alone is not priests, because we've been preaching lessons all year about the priesthood. And we recognize from previous lessons that the function of priests existed long before Israel's priesthood. We've talked about how that began back in the Garden of Eden. And we've talked about various people who have served as priests before Israel ever had priests. So what I'm saying to you now should not be shocking to you, that Israel is not the only nation who has priests in the Old Testament. But if you're just reading the Old Testament casually, you might think that they are. And so what I want to do today is I want to draw our attention to one man in particular to help make this point for us. That the priesthood did not belong to Israel. I want to look at a man in the book of Exodus whose name is Jethro, who served as the priest not of Israel, but of a small traveling nation called the Midianites. Let's talk a little bit about this guy, Jethro. In fact, I'd invite you to open up to Exodus chapter 2 if you'd like to follow along and keep up with where we're at. Because we have to go back to this story of Moses. And you may remember this story, so I'll race through it somewhat quickly. But Moses fled from Egypt not once but twice. Of course, we remember most often the story of the Exodus, where Moses flees with the entire nation of the Israelites behind him, running through or walking through the parted Red Sea waters. But that wasn't the first time that Moses fled from Egypt. The first time that Moses fled from Egypt was back in Exodus chapter 2. You may remember that Moses had killed an Egyptian. He was trying to defend a Hebrew, one of his own kinsmen, one of his own family, one of his own people. And so Moses was now running from the Egyptians in fear for his own life because he had killed one of the Egyptians. And the text tells us, this is Exodus chapter 2, verse 15, it says that after he had left Egypt, he settled in the land of Midian. Now at this point, Moses, who was a Hebrew by nationality, by blood, but was raised in Pharaoh's house, at this point now, Moses is homeless. He has run away from every family that he has ever known. He is out in the wilderness, in a foreign land. He is homeless and he is helpless. He is wandering around in a foreign, deserted land. And wouldn't you know what the very next words are? In the Bible, in verse 16, when Moses needs God most, God gives him a priest. Now the priest of Midian are the very next words that we read about Moses. Now, just to summarize the story quickly here again, this priest of Midian that we're introduced to in verse 16, this priest of Midian becomes Moses' family. The priest's daughters care for Moses. They provide him water. Moses marries one of the priest's daughters. Her name is Zipporah. And so Jethro, this priest of Midian, becomes Moses' father-in-law. And Moses becomes a shepherd of Jethro's sheep, and he lives with the Midianites. He lives with Jethro. He works with Jethro. There is a sense here in which God uses Jethro as a representation of his own care for Moses. When Moses needed help most, it was Jethro who mediated God's presence and mirrored God's love to him. Moses met a priest of Yahweh, one who looked like Yahweh, one who took care of Yahweh's things, of his people in this case. But Jethro is not a standard Old Testament priest because he's not an Israelite. Jethro is a Midianite. And if I can just say a couple of things about Midianites generally, Midianites are seem to be a semi-nomadic people. They sort of traveled around. They had a stretch of land. You'll find them on maps. Midianites tended to live down near the Red Sea. But they tended to travel, it seems. The Midianites were descendants of Abraham. Through Abraham's second wife, Keturah, after Sarah's death, we read about that in Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 through 4, where Abraham had other sons and daughters after the death of Sarah through his second wife, Keturah, and one of those sons was Midian. And through Abraham's descendants here, these Midianites come about, and they become nomads just like Abraham. Just like Abraham wandered around in the land, so his descendants wandered around near the land that he wandered in. But the Midianites were not Israelites. They weren't a part of the family of Jacob. Jethro was not a part of the special family that God was interacting with in the Old Testament. Jethro is one of the nations. He's one of the Gentiles, as they'll come to be known. And in this way, Jethro fits the pattern of other priests in the Bible that we've already talked about. Men like Melchizedek, who was not a part of Israel, but served as a priest of Yahweh anyway. People perhaps like Job, who served as a priest, or maybe some of the other patriarchs that we've read about in the Old Testament. Maybe even someone like Balaam, just to name a few men, outside of the bounds of Israel's family, and yet in some way interacting as Yahweh's priests. Men like these, men like Jethro, are non-Israelite representatives of God. And even though Jethro is not a part of Israel's family, Jethro is ultimately remembered in the text as a priest of Yahweh. There's a lot of ambiguity around Jethro, and I don't want to try to make him out to be something that the text doesn't say that he is. There's a lot of ambiguity around Jethro. There's a lot of questions that we don't have answered about this character. It's not entirely clear if you read our introduction to Jethro, if you take the time later today to go read Exodus chapter 2 and 3, and later on some of the other story about him in chapter 18, which we'll look at here in a minute. It's not entirely clear whether Jethro is initially a priest of Yahweh, or if he is a priest of some sort of other pagan religion or pagan deities. It's not clear to us. The Bible doesn't tell us which god Jethro is a priest over or for, which god he is a priest serving. But it is worth noting again that as a Midianite, Jethro was a descendant of Abraham. And I can't help but imagine that Jethro might have learned his family's stories about Yahweh and the promises that God gave his forefather Abraham. And so whether that had become distorted over the years, the text doesn't tell us. But Jethro has at least a family heritage that goes back to Yahweh as God. Regardless, after Moses led Israel out of Egypt, after the 10 plagues in the book of Exodus, and after they walk through the Red Sea, and all of the Israelites are camping out in the wilderness, there's a story that happens in Exodus chapter 18 where we meet Jethro again. And Jethro, in this occasion, meets up with his son-in-law, and this is what he said. So this is Exodus chapter 18, verses 10 through 11. Jethro says, "Blessed be Yahweh, who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods." Whatever Jethro's view of Yahweh was before he interacted with Moses, the Exodus story itself, the plagues that God afflicted on Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, and the deliverance of Israel out of Egyptian bondage, that story caused Jethro to conclude that Yahweh was the greatest of all the heavenly beings. That Yahweh was the God who presided over all other gods. And although the wording isn't used here, that's the same kind of designation that Melchizedek used of God. El Elyon, God Most High. Jethro's priesthood isn't described in detail. But when we finish reading his story, we discover that he is a Gentile who is serving Yahweh now as a priest. But I want to take this one step further and notice two things in particular that happen here in chapter 18 that I think shed some interesting light on the priesthood of Jethro. Jethro's priesthood is not just any priesthood. He is not just another priest of Yahweh that we find in the Bible. There are ways that his priesthood is put on par with or greater than the priesthood that would follow with Aaron's descendants. Jethro, in many ways, is described as a greater priest than Israel's priesthood. Let me show you two reasons why I think that is. First, in Exodus chapter 18, verses 5 through 12, Jethro takes a leadership role over Aaron in sacrificing to Yahweh. Let's read some of this in Exodus chapter 18. I think we have the time for this. Down in verse 5, this is what the story says. This is what the text says. "Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness where he was camped at the Mount of God. He sent word to Moses, 'I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her.' Then Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare, and went into the tent." Okay. I don't want to make too much out of details that I don't need to make too much about. But I find it really interesting that Moses and Jethro, when they come together after the Exodus event, verse 7 tells us that they went into the tent together. Now, at first glance, that may seem like a simple historical detail. He's just telling us the story. They just went inside to catch up or something like that. But if we're careful readers of the Old Testament, we might remember stories from Genesis where important people built tents at important places and moments. Do you remember when we talked about the patriarchs? And how almost every time that one of the patriarchs had an encounter with God, they would stop there in that place and they would build their tent. They would set up their tent where God was. And that was a sign of priesthood. This is priestly language. Setting up tents is priestly language. We see Moses and Jethro doing the same thing here. They come to the Mount of God, verse 5 says. After experiencing the presence of God in the Exodus, God is with them, actually in a very tangible way, because you'll remember that God is appearing with them in this cloud of fire and smoke, leading them out of Egypt. And Jethro comes with Moses, and they apparently set up this tent together where God is. This tabernacle they build. The patriarchs set up tents like this. God's first dwelling among his people was in a tent, the tabernacle. So when we find Moses and Jethro, representatives of God both, entering a tent, it should send up flags for us. This is priestly language. This is something interesting happening here. But what's even more interesting is what happens when they get in the tent. While they're in the tent, look at what happens down in verse 12. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before God. While they were in the tent, Jethro offers sacrifices. In fact, it seems that the text leads us to conclude that Jethro initiates the offering of these sacrifices. And this is significant because Moses is right there. The man who spoke face to face with God, who saw God in the burning bush, is there. Aaron is right there. The man who would become the high priest and alone be able to go into the presence of God is there in the tent with them. The elders of Israel are there. All the people that we would expect to step up as spiritual leaders in Israel are right there. And we might expect for one of them to make the sacrifice, but it's not one of them. It's Jethro, the Gentile, the Midianite priest, who sets up the sacrifices and who establishes the meal. It's Jethro that initiates sacrifice, not Aaron. It's Jethro that everybody has come to eat with, not Aaron. Jethro is presented here as the priest in charge in this scenario. And I don't think that's an accident. There's a second thing that he does that I think shows his superiority, at least in this instance, over the priesthood of Israel, which happens beginning in verse 13, when Jethro takes an advisory role over Moses. Look at verse 13. Let's read some of this together. It came about the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood about Moses from the morning until the evening. Now when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, and all the people stand about you from morning until evening?" Moses said to his father-in-law, "Well, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor, and make known the statutes of God and his law." Moses had clearly by this point become the de facto leader. In fact, the leader appointed by God, I should say. He was the leader appointed by God over all Israel, which meant that when people had issues, they came to him. When they wanted to know what God said, they came to him. If they wanted to understand what it was that God wanted for them, they came to him. And so Moses is clearly the leader in this situation. All the people are looking to him to guide. But Jethro watched Moses interact with the people in this way, and it's Jethro, the Gentile priest, who inserts himself. He says in verse 17, "The thing that you are doing is not good. You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. Now, Jethro's advice, if you go on to read it, is fairly simple. He suggests that Moses should set up a sort of a hierarchy, teach lower level leaders to teach the people throughout Israel, and then Moses could use his time to handle the major issues or questions that arise from time to time. And Jethro ends in verse 23. He says, if you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people also will go to their place in peace. And then the text simply says, verse 24, Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he had said. By the way, that's Al's favorite verse in the Bible. Moses was the man who had spoken directly to God at the burning bush. Moses was the man who led Israel out of Egypt. Moses was the man who had performed unthinkable miracles through his staff, through his hands. Moses was the one who parted the Red Sea, of course, using God's power through him. But it was through Moses. Moses was the instrument. Moses was the tool. But even this Moses concedes to the advice of a priest, a Gentile priest, no less. Not Aaron, his brother, who would be the high priest, but Jethro. Jethro is presented as the superior representative of God's knowledge in this scenario. Jethro represents God's wisdom here. So Jethro isn't just another priest. He's a great priest. In fact, his priesthood is presented in these stories in chapter 18 as being superior to the priestly leaders who are already set up over Israel. I think Jethro is a fascinating character, and he's one that we don't need to overlook. Jethro, the priest of Midian, is so intriguing for a lot of reasons. He's yet another priest of Yahweh, or at least he ends up as one. He unexpectedly takes priority over Israel's priestly leaders, but what makes Jethro most interesting to me, or at least what I want to impress upon you today in this lesson, is this. Jethro is a superior priest of Yahweh as a Gentile. He's not a Jew. He's not one of God's chosen people. And yet God sets him up as his priest, as his representative. When you dig into the historical stories in the Old Testament, it becomes hard to imagine Gentiles serving as Yahweh's priests. And yet from time to time, as we read the Bible carefully, we find these reminders. Reminders like Jethro, that God has representatives even among the Gentiles. Even if only temporarily, God has his priests among all the nations. In reality, Jethro's priesthood is a glimpse back to the idyllic situation in the Garden of Eden, where all humans represent God in creation. That was the way it was intended to be. All humans were supposed to be image bearers. We were all, despite what nation we came from, or what language we speak, or what people we have in our bloodline, all of us are designed to be representatives of God, priests of God Most High, priests of Yahweh. And so Jethro gives us a glimpse back at that. It's not just Israel that's supposed to be the priesthood. It is all nations that is supposed to be the priesthood. And in doing so, Jethro's priesthood also points forward to a future day in which Jesus would shed his own blood so that people from all nations can become priests of Yahweh. By the way, that's where this story is going, if you haven't already picked up on it. That's where the story is going to end. It's not just about Israel's priesthood. It's about anybody who reflects the image of God to those around them. The Bible's stories about priests push us towards this recognition that we are supposed to be priests. Yeah, you're not an Israelite. Well, maybe some of you are, I don't know. My guess is that most of us aren't, just based on where we live and what, our cultural background is. You may not be an Israelite. You may not be a Levite. But that doesn't mean that you're not supposed to be a priest. We are supposed to represent Yahweh. And so the question I'll leave us with for us to consider is, are you fulfilling this role to which God has called you? Are you living like the priest God made you to be? Are you following in the footsteps of Jethro, who was one of the nations and yet served Yahweh as a priest and a representative? If you're not doing that, then we'd love to help you with that. We'd love to sit down and talk with you about what the Bible's commands are and what the direction is for your life and how to live a life that reflects the glory of God to all creation. And so if there's something that we can do to help you with that right now, we can help you come to faith in Christ, come wash your sins away through baptism, we'd love to have an opportunity to do just that. And you're welcome to come now. Let us know what we can do as we stand and sing a song together.
Rest of the